grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm one of your hosts, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating, not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Today's guest is a former family court judge who chaired the Forced Adoption Apology Reference Group and advised the Department of Health and Australian Psychological Society on forced adoption. He is now a semi-retired adjunct professor in law at Monash University. He joins us from Victoria, where heavy COVID-19 restrictions are again in place. Welcome to Adopt Perspective, Nahum Mushin.
Thanks, Jo.
Now, we've recorded this episode just as the predicted second wave of COVID-19 hits Victoria. How are things down there for you as the restrictions tighten back up?
Well, my wife and I have been in glorious isolation down at our home. We actually live very close to the centre of Melbourne, but we've had this place on the Mornington Peninsula for nearly 40 years. And we've been in glorious isolation down here. It's very cold, particularly considering what you Queenslanders experience. But everybody's finding it difficult. The isolation, the psychology and emotion of being isolated and not being able to lead your normal life is really quite significant, and we're seeing it hit home with people because we're all social animals in one way or another, and we need to pursue that social interest and need for our well-being, and that gives you a very nice segue actually into the whole area of adoption and forced adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. And we wish you a really speedy return to the lighter restrictions down there, and hopefully we won't follow you into those
I think we're in this for some weeks to come, Jo, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Nahum, on the 23rd of June 2012, the then Attorney General Nicola Roxon announced the Australian government's intention to issue a national apology for those affected by forced adoption practices. A short time later, a reference group made up of senators, an MP, and people affected by forced adoption was established to provide advice on the wording, timing, and delivery of that apology. You're invited to chair both that reference group and the implementation group. That is quite the responsibility. Can you tell us a bit about how that process works?
Well, it started one evening at dinner time, actually, when I received a phone call from a very senior member of the Attorney General's Department. Nicola Roxon, of course, was the Attorney General, as you correctly said, and if I may say, with respect, an outstanding Attorney General. And this woman from the department asked me whether my name could be put forward for consideration of the position of chair of the Forced Adoptions Apology Reference Group. And I had actually read the report at that stage, and I knew very much what she was talking about, and I'd seen the recommendations with regard to the apology. So I very enthusiastically accepted that, didn't have to go away and think about it at all. And then what happens is you wait weeks, you don't hear anything until it was at least several weeks later that the Attorney General's Chief of Staff rang me and formally invited me for to accept that appointment, which I was very pleased to do, and that was announced in the media. I think 48 hours later. So that was the actual process.
Yeah. And I think you had 4 meetings over 18 months. Is that right? To sit down and discuss the wording and that kind of thing. Is that correct?
The Apology Reference Group itself met 4 times.
Yeah.
We also had several telephone meetings. But in addition to that, I was very active as part of that, doing consultations right around Australia with regard to apology.
Yeah. So when you read the Senate inquiry report, and I guess through the process of chairing these committees or groups, I should say, what did you learn about forced adoption?
Well, the very first emotion is, I think, one of horror. To think that an intelligent, educated, developed society like Australia could have treated such vast numbers of its citizens in that way. It's something that has always stuck with me. We've had similar events, and the most outstanding one, of course, is the Stolen Generation one. But it's just absolutely horrendous, and the emotional reaction to that, I can remember it to this day, was really quite profound.
Yeah. I know that when you first read the report into the form of forced adoption policies and practices, one concept really jumped out at you. Can you tell me what it was and why you were willing to go to the barricades to ensure its inclusion in the apology?
Well, Jo, as you know, I've been a lawyer all my life, first a solicitor, then a barrister, and then 21 years as a judge of the family court. And the word illegal jumped out at me and has been with me all the time. The reality about forced adoption is that it involves constant, vast and egregious breaches of the law by people in positions of authority, and that had to be called out because if it weren't illegal, if everything that happened had been in accordance with the law, and I emphasise it wasn't, but if it had been, then really the whole aspect of the apology was quite different, because really all then you would be apologising for is the law itself. That is, the law itself is wrong rather than the way it was applied. Now, I think there are lots of areas in which the law was wrong, and we'll discuss that as we go on in this discussion. But the way in which it was applied is, my word is egregious, is absolutely egregious. It was wrong. It was illegal. And you don't have to be a lawyer to know that, but if you are a lawyer, the nuances of it really jump out at you.
Yeah, it's quite profound.
And yes, you said I was prepared to go to the barricades. That's a word that I've used quite often, and in fact, right at the very beginning, I can remember during a morning tea break of that first meeting of the reference group, Attorney General Roxon had attended that group, and I took her aside and I said, look, this apology has to include the word illegal. Without the word illegal, it doesn't have the effect and the force that it is required to have. And the whole concept of an apology requires you to be honest about what you're apologising about, to be detailed about it. And to her eternal credit, Ms. Roxon accepted that without the slightest hesitation, and it all went on from there.
Yeah. And I can understand why you were thinking you could have to go to the barricades, because historically governments don't like to have a word like that used, because then it can lead to compensation and things that governments don't want to think about.
Yes, well, you see, my view about this is that if somebody's entitled to compensation, they're entitled to compensation, and governments have an absolute responsibility to their citizens to provide that compensation if that's the appropriate way to go, so that dodging the legal aspects of it, particularly, I mean, I can understand private individuals do that. As to whether they should or not is a matter of debate in each case, but certainly for governments, governments need to face these things, and to their eternal credit, the government of the day, led in those circumstances by the Attorney General, went down that path and wasn't concerned about the possible legal consequences of using that word.
Yeah. Now, we use an excerpt from the apology at the beginning of each podcast episode, as we know that many people have yet to even hear the apology or to understand that it could pertain to their own experiences. I regard that speech as one of the most powerful that I've heard in my lifetime, and I was absolutely shattered on the day that it was delivered, because it was overshadowed by a leadership challenge. Can I ask you if you were there at the time, and can you tell us about that day and how you felt about it?
Oh, Joe, mentioning that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I must say. Yes, I was there. Now, just by way of backstory with regard to that, at about 9 o'clock on that morning, it was the 21st of March 2013, who could forget it, I, together with all the members of the reference group, met with the Prime Minister Gillard, in her office to have a chat about the apology. And you may remember in that speech that she referred to a number of things that she'd been told by members of the reference group. She didn't actually say that they were members of the reference group, but she referred to it. I must say, I watched and listened to that speech again yesterday in anticipation of this morning, and it's still one of the most moving events. But what really stands out for me is that during that meeting, which went for, I think, 3/4 of an hour or so, maybe an hour, in the Prime Minister's office, there was not the slightest hint of what was going on politically, and yet we later learned that she was already well aware of it. She'd been visited earlier that day and been informed that this was happening, but she gave not one hint at all of it. And the character and personality of a person who can handle herself like that is absolutely laudable. Well, during the previous day and that day, the day of the apology, I'd done, 6 or 8 media interviews, none of which got to air because of what happened later. Yes, I was there. After the apology, there was a lunch on the lawns outside Parliament House, and I was there mixing with lots of people. It was a very, to a certain extent, subdued and a very sort of thoughtful occasion where people were mulling over what had happened with this extraordinary apology. And incidentally, I agree with you. I think that speech is one of the really great moments of Australia's political life. I think it was quite exceptional.
Ultimately, a story of strength, as those affected by forced adoptions found their voice, organised and shared their experiences, and by speaking truth to power, brought about the apology we offer today. This story had its beginnings in a wrongful belief that women could be separated from their babies and it would all be for the best. Instead, these churches and charities, families, medical staff and bureaucrats struck at the most primal and sacred bond there is, the bond between a mother and her baby.
In any event, we were having lunch on the lawns, and the rumour started going round that there was a challenge. And sure enough, the rumour was confirmed. This is probably, 1 o'clock, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it completely overshadowed everything. To the extent, for example, that not one of my interviews made it to the air. That might have been because of my inadequacy in the interviews, but I like to think that it was because another item of news overtook it. Now, I was so angry with what had happened, and it was actions of Mr. Crean, of course, Mr. Simon Crean. I can remember being in my hotel that night with my wife and pacing around, and finally I sat down in front of the computer and wrote Mr. Crean an email in which I was very critical of him for what he'd done, and I said that I thought that he owed everybody an apology for the way that had occurred and taken all the oxygen out of the apology. And I have to say I didn't receive any response at all.
It's disappointing. Disappointing, yeah. It's certainly. I remember watching the news that day, and it was well down in the news bulletin. It was very small, and it was just utterly disappointing for everybody that had been involved and concerned and affected.
Yeah, Joe. There's an interesting other thing that goes back with that too. After we had delivered the apology to the government, I had a discussion with government about the form that the apology should take, the actual process. And I had ventured the view that the Stolen Generation apology delivered by then Prime Minister Rudd in February 2008 was the way in which they should go. And I was asked whether an apology in the Great Hall of Parliament House, followed by the formality in Parliament afterwards, was acceptable. And I must say I ventured the view that we should have gone the way of the Stolen Generation apology, because that was quite an extraordinary event. They in fact went the Great Hall path. I was wrong in my view, because I think the way in which they did that was quite exceptional. To have 1,000 people in the hall and then to do it formally in the Parliament was, I think, the way to go. And it really gave it enormous force, which was taken away, as we've said, by the extraordinary political efforts of later that day.
Yeah. I guess this kind of leads into my next question. The Senate report estimated that there were as many as 150,000 adoptions between 1951 to 1975 and 250,000 from 1940 to the present day. Considering that every adoption involves two biological parents, two adoptive parents, other immediate and extended family, and the adopted person themselves, it is really impossible to know how many people have been affected by forced adoption policies and practices. And yet I feel that forced adoption doesn't have near as much community recognition as some other prominent issues that occurred around that same time period. Why do you think that is?
Joe, I don't know. I think that forced adoption carries with it emotional baggage which most people find too difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
And of course, when you talk about the numbers affected, you've also, I could add to that, to say I've always described it not like dropping a pebble into a pond and seeing the ripples, but dropping a stone into the pond and seeing a tsunami.
Yeah.
And because it's not only all of those classes of people who you refer to, but it's intergenerational. And so it's handed down to the second and the third generation of people affected by forced adoption. So the grandchildren of people affected by forced adoption, by particularly mothers and to a certain extent fathers, are still being affected by it. And I had somebody come up to me not so long ago at Monash and say that they knew that I'd been involved in this forced adoption, and that this person's grandmother, who had recently passed away, had been directly affected by forced adoption. And this person was really very emotional about it. This wasn't just a statement of fact. And we sat down. We went to one of the cafeterias and we sat down and had a coffee and talked about it. And I've kept in contact with that person, and it's been very interesting indeed.
Yeah. I mean, I know my own family, certainly my own children have, I've certainly visited some of my issues onto them, and I certainly hope that through all the discussions we're having and the work that we're doing, that that can stop with that generation, I hope, and not keep continuing on down. Nahum, I've heard you say in speeches and interviews that while there have been positive resolutions since the apology, there remains considerable unfinished business. What would you like to see in the future?
This was part of the apology reference group and later the apology implementation working group that were part of the reports that we made back to government at the conclusion of each of those committees. There are all sorts of issues. One of them, for example, and I'm not putting this in any order, although I think there is one quite overwhelming one. One of them, for example, is a national day. Now, we proposed that forced adoption be recognised by the naming of a special forced adoptions day, and we suggested that should be the 21st of March because of that was the date of the apology. Mm-hmm. But government rejected that proposition simply because it was already a day specified as Harmony Day, and they didn't think they could have two days. And the response to that, which I gave, was, well, I don't see why we can't have two, but in the event that you feel that we can't have two, then let's make it another day. Let's commemorate the day on which the Senate report was handed down, but that had the problem that could be only every 4 years because it was the 29th of February. But I mean, as I said, I always felt that there was another reason for not having a day which was never set out, because I, with the greatest respect, think the explanations which I've so far heard for that are light on, let us say.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of it. I think compensation is a major thing, and I think that a government has an obligation towards compensation. Mm-hmm. I think that the harm that was done to people has been just so enormous as to warrant compensation. And of course, there's the forgotten Australians and there's the stolen generation, so that is still to be talked about. Look, the really big one to which I referred, I think, is birth certificates.
Yeah.
Now, birth certificates is a complicated issue, and there are differing views as to how this should be resolved. My view is this: the register of the birth of every individual in the society must be registered, must show the truth. And so in the event that it's adoption, whether it's forced adoption or otherwise, some would say every adoption is forced, but that's another matter. Whatever it is, needs to show the truth about that person's origins.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it is acceptable to have a birth certificate in which the parents, the mother and father of a child, are not shown.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, adoptive parents have an overwhelmingly major role to play in that child's life, and should also be shown. But they should be shown as being adoptive parents. That's a truthful statement. So that really what you should have is a register which says this is the antecedents of this child. He, she was the child of X and Y, who were the child's parents. At some later time, this child was adopted by such and such by order of such and such court on such and such a date, and these are the names and details of those people as well. So that's the starting point. Then there's a question of what document or documents should the adopted person have, and this is the crucial thing, because what we know about adoption, and particularly with regard to adoptees, is they're like every one of us in society. We need to know our roots, and we need to know where we come from, so that being able to have a birth certificate which shows all that information, in my view, is absolutely a fundamental right of every person in the society.
Yeah.
Now, there's a nuance to this, if you like, in that there are circumstances in which an adoptee does not want to show both aspects of that person's heritage. And although I'm not completely settled on this view, I think there is a really good argument for the proposition that an adopted person should have the right to have a certificate which shows any of the three combinations. That is what the register shows, that is the parents and the adopted parents on the one hand, or only the parents, or only the adopted parents. So that I think there's that right there, and I think the society needs to recognise the rights of the adoptive parents. And Joe, we haven't talked about the adopted person, I should say. We haven't talked about the adopted person. I think we need to, because the adopted person is in a position which is really extraordinarily important in this whole discussion.
Yeah. That's it. And I mean, there are some cases where as an adopted person, you know, if you're fronting up to the post office to get some identification for a passport or so on, you may not want to have that discussion with the person over the counter, but you still want to have a document that shows the truth of your heritage.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why I say that society has got to observe and recognise and give effect to the rights of the adopted person.
Yeah. So something we're seeing here in Queensland and other states now is discharges of adoption.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, this goes to a much wider question, doesn't it? And that's the question of what should modern adoption look like? And I've been arguing, I have to say, quite unsuccessfully for a very long time, that the whole area of the law of adoption needs to be reformed and have major reforms. Would you like to go down this path now? Because I think it's really very, very important.
Yeah, let's do that. I guess, I mean, you're a family court judge for years, so is simple adoption the answer?
Okay. The starting point of this is that there are undoubtedly cases in which, and I don't talk about cases in the strict legal sense, I mean in the wider sense, there are circumstances in which a child cannot be cared for by his or her parents. The usual bases for that are mental disability or drugs or alcohol addiction or other disabilities, and making primary care of that child by those or one of those parents contrary to the child's interests. And let me just emphasise what I've just said. This is about the question, what is in the best interests of the child? It is not about the adoptive parents, and it is not about the parents, it's about the child, and it's got to remain about the child. That has been the basis of Australian law for a very long time now, and it is right. And my 21 years on the family court tells me that. So that we need a legal structure by which strangers to the child can be ordered, can have an order in their favour that they have the care of that child. That's the starting point. Mm-hmm. Now, my work in forced adoption tells me that the word adoption is a really serious trigger, a traumatic trigger for a large number of people in society. And the question therefore has to be raised, should we be continuing to use the word adoption? Mm-hmm. Together with that, it seems to me that having a separate law of adoption that is separate from the law relating to the disposition of circumstances in which a child's care is under question, usually in the family law sense where the relationship between his or her parents has broken down, that what is now adoption should be conducted on the same basis as relationship breakdown in family law. Yeah. Then I get to the stage of saying, why is it that a child adopted in Albury and a child adopted in, in your Queensland sense, Joe, Tweedheads and Surfers Paradise, why should they be adopted pursuant to two different laws just because of a state border? Why should not the law in this area be uniform right through the country, as it is in family law? And if you put all of that together, then why is it that you need a separate adoption law which sits alongside the Family Law Act and is applied by different courts, the state courts? Why shouldn't you amalgamate it with the whole of the family law? You would need to make amendments to the Family Law Act, but that's not beyond the wit of people, even lawyers. And in those circumstances, why can't you meld the whole thing together? Now, I've argued this in legal political circles for many, many years with absolutely no success at all. But it's a question which I don't think has ever been satisfactorily, or at least to my mind, satisfactorily answered.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you say adoption is a trigger word for many people who've been affected, and certainly that was the case for me this week. Because lately we've had a lot of terrible stories in the media about trauma and abuse under the supervision of child protection authorities, and there always follows a call that adoption is the answer. And this week in Queensland, we had an announcement from the Department of Child Safety that they're tabling amendments to the Child Protection Act to clarify adoption as an option for achieving permanency. So, as soon as that comes out, I'm triggered. I know a lot of other people are. Sometimes I feel like it's a knee-jerk response. Like, what are your thoughts when you hear things like that?
Well, Joe, you've been kind enough to send me the material, and particularly the media release of the Minister for Child Safety, Youth and Women in Queensland.
Yeah.
There's one word that jumps out at me when I read this, and that's the word permanency. Because my time in family law tells me that talking about permanent relationships, permanent arrangements for a child defies the concept of the upbringing of a child. The reality is that a child of 2 has different needs to a child of 12, and we need to recognise that. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, in family law, in relationship breakdown, that the orders that we make for that child at 2, for example, to see the other, the secondary parent, if you like, if there is a secondary parent, for 2 hours twice a week, might become 2 out of 3 weekends and half the school holidays, or something like that. And you need to be able to adapt the circumstances of the orders that a court makes to the needs of a child at a particular time. So talking about permanency is, in my view, with profound respect to the Minister, is fallacious. I think really what you need to do is talk about long term. Yes, you need to think about giving the child as much security in his or her upbringing and the circumstances in which he or she lives as you can, but you need to recognise that those circumstances change, and nothing that is nowhere more emphasised than in circumstances concerning a disabled child. The reality is that adoptions go wrong in the same way as family law orders go wrong. And you don't have permanency. The orders you make today, you hope, will last until the child reaches 18, at which time he or she is empowered by the law to make his or her own decisions. But the reality is that it doesn't happen like that, and you can revisit cases every year or 2 or whatever in some circumstances, and that's particularly in the area of children growing up with parents who are disagreeing.
Yeah.
So can I just add one other thing too?
Yeah.
My family law experience and the evidence is overwhelming that parents who fight create a troubled child, and that it's an absolute truism in child rearing. Mm-hmm. And one of the really important aspects that you look for in making decisions with respect to children affected by relationship breakdown is the preparedness of each of the parents to promote the child's relationship with the other parent. And we know from forced adoption that adopted people need to know what their heritage is, and they should be treated in exactly the same way. That is, if the circumstances are right, they should have every opportunity to have an ongoing relationship with their parents. And in case there are uninitiated people in this area, I'm using parents in terms of what would be called biological parents, but it is... Sorry.
That's all right. It had to be one of us that had a call come in.
Yeah, I thought I'd silence this.
That's all right. I've got a teenager yelling outside my bedroom. Outside my office door here. So
yeah, well, we'll
also have your phone and my teenager.
We've also got builders here. I was scared that there'd be noise, but there hasn't been, fortunately. Just let me go back to that. You let that out, obviously, Joe. In case people are wondering about my terminology, I use the word parent and mother and father as being what some call the biological mother or the biological father or the biological parent. Mm-hmm. But we drop the word biological because it's a tautology. If you're the mother, you're the mother. You're the person who gave birth to the child. And you don't need the word birth, mother, or biological or whatever. Mm-hmm. So an important part, returning to the main point, an important part of the provisions with respect to adoption, and this is very controversial, in my view, has to be the preparedness of the adopting parents to promote the child's relationship with the parents. And if they're not prepared to do so, that can be a negative aspect of your consideration of whether an adoption order should be made.
Yeah. I know that the Victorian state government will soon be beginning their own inquiry into forced adoption. It's been delayed by COVID. What can you tell us about that process and as it's coming up and what your thoughts are? Well,
it hasn't gone very far at all yet. That the committee has been established and they were supposed to get going. I think they were supposed to get going next week, but again, because of this extra lockdown here in Greater Melbourne, that's been put off. But I'm being consulted, others as well. I'm being consulted by the secretary to the committee, and there are going to be hearings. I'm hoping that all of those issues, birth certificates, compensation, law reform, and all of those sort of things will be considered by this committee. It's too early yet, but I think it's important to note that is happening. May I just say this, that I think the project you're undertaking by these interviews is an excellent one. I've listened to the others in the series, and if I may say with respect that I think, I hold Jigsaw in the highest esteem, and that includes all of you in it, but if I may name somebody, that is Trevor Jordan. I think the work that you and all your support organisations right through Australia and the peer groups with them are doing is just quite exceptional and more strength to your arm.
Thank you so much for that. And we truly appreciate your time today, Nahum. And I have to say that you've been such a great friend to Jigsaw Queensland and the adoption community, and have really championed for us. And you're always so generous with your time, and we just cannot thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us. And we'll say goodbye now to Nahum Mushin.
Thanks and goodbye.
Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number, and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.